it saying about feet of clay and building towers of old Tower of Babel thing? How does it go? So hello and welcome to episode 3 of Chronicles of a Photojournalist. Now that moment I think actually had very unlucky repercussions, and it's actually well known in Namibia that to push over these stone cairns is there's superstitions around it that it is it's not advised. You can bring on an omen on yourself, and so believe it or not, something did happen later that day. So in this episode we're going to look at 2 visits I did to the Fish River Canyon. The first I did on my own, sort of using my own vehicle, and the second visit, which I didn't expect, the manager sort of set me up with a guide and allowed me to look around via this guide, and as far as I remember it was on the house, so I was allowed to go and sort of have sundowners and all sorts of other things with guests. You know, they would pay the full rate, of course, and I went along for free, and it was actually really good. Actually quite liked the guide, the female guide that was doing the thing, and we actually took a photo together at the top of well, on the edge of the Fish River Canyon. Right, so if you look there in the distance, you can see those dark, kind of look like blemishes. There's actually pretty big piles of rock. There are 2, there's one, there's another one, there's another one. Those are dolerite dikes. You can actually see in the distance is a kind of a dark, sort of a black one over there. Those are dolerite dikes, so it's basically volcanic material that sort of I don't want to say bubbled up to the surface, but basically found its way to the surface and created these pretty incredible piles of rock. You know, up close it actually looks like a giant has put a bunch of big stones or rocks or blocks, piled them onto each other, almost like Lego. So it's almost like being an ant in a landscape filled with little ant heaps, except they're not. And it's actually because of these dolerite dikes that South Africa is not really, the southern hemisphere is not really ideal for something like fracking, and because every now and then you're going to hit this really hard rock, and that's what there is opportunity for fracking, but you're going to have this difficulty where you're going to get these really hard layers. See, so this is one of those dolerite dikes I was talking about. You can see how the path goes from very light cream to this kind of dark chocolate color. And this is a dolerite dike, which is kind of volcanic rock. It sort of seeped through the earth to the surface and then cooled, and then forms a rock called dolerite. Okay, I've kind of had a thought which may have pretty huge repercussions, just around the whole idea of paths and pathways. If you look at, there's a path, can't quite see it there, but it goes down there. If you ask yourself, what's the origin of a path? Did someone consciously start making one, or was it just something that happened as a byproduct of patterns of movement? And once those patterns of movement had occurred regularly enough, the pathways were just a symptom of that. In other words, a byproduct of these patterns. But once those byproducts were there, people and animals didn't really have to think so consciously about where they were going. It's a totally different thing navigating over terrain where there's no path to one where there is a path. As soon as there is a path, you don't really have to think about where you're going or think about what you're stepping over. And so it's possible that just in the same way that the fire gave us kind of a reprieve of the stresses of life, trying to keep warm, trying to protect ourselves, paths may have done something similar, just given us a chance to think about other things while we were trying to get from A to B. So think about this idea of a path and not having a path in the context of the coronavirus. What happens if there's not a path? Okay, well, I'm feeling quite chuffed about this morning. I see a little dusty up there. Yeah, while I was in the room making notes, a gemsbok or an oryx walked past the window and the door quite close to my little hut, and that's of course the iconic image of Keith Alexander, which is the oryx or the gemsbok, and then situated, juxtaposed with a house, and often in the doorway, seen from the doorway or through the window. So I was pretty happy to get that, which sort of balances out the fact that I got an email from the editor saying that the piece is too long, and instead of editing it down, I'm probably going to rewrite the whole thing. So that's just how it goes, I guess. So we're going to make our way now slowly to the viewing point with the Fish River Canyon. And I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about my unhappiness, just that I touched on very slightly there with magazine journalism. It was specifically with one magazine, but it was also in a general way, just that I wasn't really feeling fulfilled with my work. I was successful, but in order to be successful, if a magazine editor said jump, I would basically ask how high. And I was just doing a lot of bending over backwards for them, and they were doing what they do best, which is be arseholes. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but certainly in South Africa, if an editor doesn't get what they want, they just throw your work away and take someone else's work. And what I didn't like with quite a few editors was I was delivering exceptional standards of work, and you would think that after a while you're developing a relationship with them, and that they would then treat you better, and they simply don't. They're simply just tyrants, and they used to telling people what to do and getting whatever they want, and while they sit in their offices. And I was actually getting quite sick of it. And the particular article that I wrote here, when it came out, it sort of ticked a little bell in my mind where I was just like, I don't really want to do this anymore. I enjoy the work, but I don't enjoy what's on the other side of it. And you might say that that's not good, that kind of arrogance isn't good, but in another way it is. You need that kind of healthy narcissism to say, I want to do what I want to do. Because without it, the counter to that is, how long are you going to do what someone else wants you to do? You see what I'm saying? Right, so notice the difference between this whitish rock, kind of almost crystalline, and then there's a kind of like a silky sandstone. sandstone layer. I'm not sure if that's right, but then it becomes this much darker, blacker, harder and more angular rock, which is right. So yesterday evening I actually met with Manny Goldberg. His name's actually Manfred. I've actually met him before, and he's the owner of the Gondwanaland collection. I think he used to be a history teacher, and his tagline for all these lodges that he's built is having a story to tell. You know, yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Yeah, he kind of showed me I told him I was doing this thing about Keith Alexander, and he showed me some art by a local artist, and he actually says that he operates a publishing company, so I should maybe ask him if he can publish Bloodline. I mean, that's a book I would love to see in print, so maybe I'll just chat to him about it. But yeah, he's quite a visionary. He built up a whole bunch of hotels, not sort of your typical big cold hotel. That all of them feel very integral to the environment. All of them feel environment, very conscious of the environment, and uplifting the community and all that kind of thing. So yeah, he's done an incredible job, and I think the same way that my book started, his hotel started. You know, it was with the idea of an interest in the nature here, and an interest in conserving the nature. It wasn't really to build hotels. So it's interesting how things work and how things happen. So, do you remember that stone cairn that I knocked over right at the beginning? And I said it was recognized as an omen of bad luck. I immediately built another one, almost sort of to make up for that. And then later on I read about it, and they were just saying how there is the superstition around it. And then when I drove in the vehicle to the fish of a canyon, to the edge, there was oddly enough, there was a stone, almost like the size of a brick, standing on its sort of elongated end. So it was about the height of a brick, and it was just in the middle of the road. And I just wasn't able to miss it. It's not that I hit it, but I sort of went over it, and the bottom of the chassis of the Mercedes caused it to spin. And it sort of spun under the vehicle, and it smashed into the rear wheel, and then I got a flat tire. So this footage you're seeing of the edge of the Fish River Canyon, my vehicle, the tire's flat. And so what I actually asked the guys to do was, there were some people sort of hanging around there as well. I asked someone, kind of as a joke, would you fix this tire for the equivalent of about $10, 200 rand? And the guy was like, sure. and I guess I just wasn't in the mood to spend an hour trying to figure out, because obviously I can change a tire, but when it's not your vehicle, and it's quite a complicated thing getting that tire out from under the chassis. I wanted to just have my moment next to the canyon, and so unfortunately someone volunteered, and they did it. If I was in a parking lot and someone said to me, would you please change my tire for $10, I'd be like, sure, I know how to do it, no problem. But in the situation I was in, I was like, well, you want to do this? And the guy said yes, so it was sort of mutually beneficial. Okay, so as we transition from the first visit to the Fish River Canyon to the second, let's look at a couple of images from Keith Alexander. Now, there's something dystopian about his images. There's something surrealistic about them. It takes a while after looking at them to see that there's more than just what you're seeing. And apparently, Keith Alexander painted a lot of his pictures while high on marijuana. And I think that explains part of it, but the other part is his backstory. He grew up in Zimbabwe, at the time Rhodesia. And I think it's something if you're a European living in Africa, there's a sense of disquiet that certain things that you build in Africa will be lost. Things that you accumulate will become wrecked, or they'll just sort of end up not where you intended. But there's something beautiful about the way Keith Alexander represents it. It's both haunting and tragic, and I think it also speaks to the whole human condition on earth, that the things made by man aren't going to last, and that nature may well outlive us and the things we built. So the landscape, with all its rocks and quietness and emptiness, sort of calls to you. And the canyon obviously speaks to you about even the rocks lack resilience, or they have resilience in certain places. And so it challenges us to think about our resilience, doesn't it? Okay, and so here we are the next day, and I really love this sign with a squiggle on it. As I say, I love road signs. There's another squiggle in the road closer to the canyon. You can see on the left it's sort of level, on the right it's falling away. And this sort of setting is also evokes one of my favorite paintings of Keith Alexander. And if you look at this particular image, you have the road on the left, and then you have this decaying landscape, literally falling into a chasm on the right. And so there's something quite weird about going to the exact same spot the next day, but in a totally different way. Instead of me driving, someone else is driving. Instead of me being alone with my camera, I was with kind of a gaggle of tourists. They were quite an interesting bunch, quite a few people from, I think it was England, and a couple of people from Australia. And so it was interesting getting their view, some of it very kind of from the common man perspective, and some of it quite, I won't say profound, but quite interesting, what people were thinking. And you have this odd situation where you're in the middle of nowhere, there's nothing and nothingness, and there's a bunch of people gathered to observe the nothingness. It's as if nothing is something, and nothing is something to see. And what certainly is different out here is the scale of things, how far you can see, and also the critters that live here. And we'll get to that in a moment. So on a previous visit to the Fish River Canyon, I did actually hike it, or I hiked a section of it. Really memorable experience that was. Of course, this isn't really compared to the Grand Canyon, which is, I guess, grander than this, but the Fish River Canyon is the second biggest in the world. And so the views that you see from the plateau are sort of almost incomprehensible. You can't really figure out what's going on just because of the scale of things.
Especially when you can go down into a canyon. Yes. It's basically
And I guess this is a place for people to come to feel their smallness, or in a way to stand on the landscape and to stand out from it or stand up upon it. And at the end of my article I spoke about a portrait of resilience, and isn't that exactly what this is? Isn't this exactly what we're looking at? And so this is my favorite painting by Keith Alexander. I just love the combination of hyperreality and surreality, the almost fantasy aspect of the very square landscape. It also almost looks like fields that have been planted and then they just fall away into decay. And look at that sky as well. And in a way, this painting seems to speak about what's happening with the coronavirus. You know, that flat level plane is kind of like civilizations, this floor upon which we think the economic substrate is something that's not going to change, right? The substrate of suburbia is inviolable, and yet you have something like a canyon, something that just falls down into itself. How does that happen? Well, the same way coronavirus happens, it's part of nature. And so what I find quite challenging about a portrait like this is thinking about a story to fit this, you know, some kind of, whether it's science fiction or some kind of dystopian story where the logic and the science fiction aspect of what is depicting here come together in something that represents that. And I wrote a book called Bloodline that's set in the future, that's set in a kind of dystopia, and that I guess is my written version of this feeling of human resilience that fails in the face of nature, in terms of nature's overwhelming forces of erosion, right? That was my attempt to I guess do a Keith Alexander. I'm a little bit different to him in that I can't write when I've had a couple of drinks, or you know, I need to be completely sober. Anyway, this particular image, I took this particular image with the painting of Keith Alexander in mind. I wanted to represent it as best I could, that painting, in something from the Fish River Canyon, and that was kind of my attempt. And I must say I would have been flattered if Country Life had published it, but of course they didn't publish a single image from the strip. And the joke of it, which I'll explain to you in a second, they published one image from something completely different, involving another story that I did on another family, and then another image that I took from a completely different trip. So everything that I took in terms of Keith Alexander, they didn't use. And they even went as far as using a painting he did of the Titanic. I mean, how can you get as far away from Namibia as painting a picture of the Titanic, like literally on the seas with all the seawater? And you know, you go there to try and capture the tones and the animals, and then they choose to use a picture of the Titanic. I know why, because on the next page they were advertising Titanic cruises or something. I can't quite remember what it was. But you know, what is happening then if you're going to so much effort to immerse yourself into the landscape? And I mean, isn't that what outdoor magazines are about? Isn't that what it's inviting the public to do? To go out there and be inspired and to marvel and be awed by the countryside. And what does the magazine editor do? They jump completely out of that, and they think, oh, this is a great opportunity to market the Titanic. So I think one of the challenges when you are photographing something like a canyon is how do you represent it without just having a vague photo of nothingness. And so a plant in front of it is one way, and that's me and the guide. Her name is Peter, spelled P-E-T-A, and she was a really good guide, and I think she's still guiding. We friends on Instagram, and whenever I see her posts, I'm kind of really tempted to go out and repeat some of those adventures. So there's almost an inversion of the earlier painting. This time it's liquid on the surface. It's like the curvature of the earth or something, and then it's just cracked into dryness, right? There's something ominous about what Keith Alexander's getting at. Anyway, we're now going to go to... We're going to sort of return to the area of the hotel and then sort of go on a night sort of safari. In this particular image, I've zoomed in on a cactus that's sort of perched on the edge much lower down, but didn't quite work. Well, I was trying to create that sort of perspective. Didn't quite. The idea was there, but it didn't execute very well. And this is an image of Keith Alexander that sort of feels like it's painted near the canyon, doesn't it? Or certainly with a canyon in mind. And so we then headed back in the vehicles. This is actually, I think, at the gate to the lookout point. As you can see, it's just miles of nothingness. It's like being on the surface of the moon with occasional tumbleweed here and there. Remember as a young kid, my father saying to me, "My boy, when you're my age, you'll be going on holiday on the moon." And that hasn't quite happened. The interesting thing about Namibia is when you're there, the scale of the country is just absolutely enormous, and part of that is almost a trick, and because there are dirt roads everywhere, instead of traveling at say 120 kilometers an hour, you often are traveling at a substantial fraction of that, like 80-90 kilometers an hour. So everything feels bigger and further and slower. And I think if you had to tar all of these roads, the effect would be sort of diminished. The charm of it would be less if you took away that dustiness. This was actually a moment where the vehicle was stopped because of the dust sort of blowing into it. That's the same grade I'd seen early in the day. So I think this was mid-afternoon, and we were heading to a location where there were really big rocks, and we were going to just really build a campfire and watch the sun go down and have a couple of drinks. And I think some people would barbecue for us, and we'd also sort of put some dough, I think, on long sticks, and then we'd cook that over the fire. That was what we were heading towards. And it's quite an amazing experience when you have that kind of, I won't say luxury, but that kind of treat in Africa, in the middle of nowhere. It just has a quality that is quite memorable and quite special. I think this is us returning to the sort of lodge area. There's actually two lodges within about 10 minutes drive of one another. The one is very bare and kind of stony, and the other one is more sort of feels a bit like a garden. So already it's a little bit late in the day now, and this is when that sort of golden light starts to develop. So before we get to the end of the day, I'm going to take you quickly through a couple of photos taken from around the lodge that I was staying in, and a couple of scenes from around where I was staying in. So there's a gemsbok that is walking within the complex. I think what was actually happening here was a staff member was chasing him away, and kind of made me a little bit, not angry, but I was a bit irritated because I was trying to get photos of him in the doorway, and it was the staff member literally chasing him away. And so these are a couple of photos of the flora and fauna in the area. So those are springbuck in the foreground. My father actually raised one in our garden back home. That's the inside of my hotel room. Quite breezy, quite simplistic, quite minimalist. And then these are communal weavers, I believe. And sometimes they build their nests on sort of windmills, and the nest can become so huge that the windmill will eventually fall over, collapse. So that's a practical illustration of Keith Alexander's dystopia, where nature finds a way of building on the wreckage of human endeavor, I guess. The whole idea with them building these nests is that snakes can't reach them. I remember it being very, very difficult getting clear photos of these birds because they were so quick, they were flying around so quickly, and there's always a branch in the way. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but there's a lot of dirt on my camera in a lot of these photos. That's not actually on the lens, that's actually on the inside of the camera, and that is something that can happen when you go to a dusty destination. So that is a baby, looks like a kudu, yeah. And so here we are at the close of day. We're getting that wonderful golden light again. This is a kokerboom forest. I can't remember the name. Is it a quiver tree? I think it's a quiver tree forest. It also gives it this alien type landscape feel, doesn't it? A lot of the vegetation looks like it comes from under the sea, and then it got very old very quickly. I think it's called the quiver tree because the Bushmen favored using the branches of this tree to make quivers to keep the arrows in. They were easy to hollow out, and they were the right sort of tubular shape to sort of sling over one's back, and they were light. And I think that is a steenbok or a daker. I'm not quite sure if it's the one or the other. And so artistically, there certainly are many ways to interpret the landscape, through shapes, through textures, through tones, through colors. Through silhouettes, to evoke that sense of loneliness, that stark sense of being alone in the landscape. So I have no idea whether this is innate or whether it's something I copied from my great-grandfather, but a lot of his paintings are from the perspective of roads. So you often see the rutted tracks of wagons or whatever. Bear in mind that his paintings were from just about when cars didn't exist to when they did. And so you had these sort of rutted tracks going into the dirt or going into the mud or something. No tar roads, of course, just these rutted tracks. And of course, when you see that, it is inviting you to go on that road, isn't it? And the viewer almost feels drawn into the picture from those particular angles. So this was the end of the day. It was actually a very nice evening, very memorable. It was a nice group of people, and then you hear the sounds of, animals. It's interesting how when we retire at the end of the day, that is when some of the animals come out to play. We're going to have a look at the aardvark, which is the Afrikaans for earth pig. We'll look at footage of that in a second.
I told you 3 minutes.
So that's something you see, is just how slowly the landscape
What was it they were looking for?
is painted, with different tones. And that's the group
What was it called?
drying their dough.
Art.
And there's the aardvark. And I've got to admit, I'd never seen one before, although you often see evidence of them. You find their burrows.
He's hungry, he's eating.
Yeah, he's heading for Australia now.
So he hears them, does he? The ants.
Yeah, I think he smells them.
Oh,
Mainly.
He's sort of got like a piggy nose.
He really doesn't seem to mind us. He just
He's
wanders
got a long
around.
nose, stouty nose.
He's eating, he's digging.
It's not got much dust yet. No, he must be
I
smelling.
wonder if you get the shit of an attacker.
You should actually walk around the other way. That'll chase him into the light.
Oh, look at it. She's having a look.
He's
So
digging
it's
now,
quite
look.
amazing seeing that, and not
God,
just
he's digging.
Is that a
seeing
bushy
it,
tail
but seeing
it's
it
got
for an
there?
extended
Yeah, it's got a
time.
long
Looks like a giant rat. And so that really kind of concludes the journey through Namibia. In the next episode, I'm going to take you through leaving Namibia. There's actually some really interesting footage there as well, just coming out of Namibia, and then also the trip down the west coast of South Africa through the Namakwa land and the daisies, and I actually wrote an article about that section, which went into a separate magazine. I actually also wrote an article about the manager in a financial magazine. So I probably got about 3-4 articles out of this particular trip. And there's another dystopian image from Keith Alexander. And so what was very frustrating after this trip, for example, is being so moved by the landscape and then handing it over to the editor and then being so unmoved by it. So this is the edition of Country Life that the article appeared in. I think it was about 7 pages long, and they used basically just the photos I provided of the artist and the paintings, virtually none of the actual trip. And this was a habit that they got into, where they would just really provide stuff from the artist or the art gallery or whatever, and it just rendered absolutely meaningless going into the area and taking photos. And that was kind of what I'd briefed the editor to begin with, that I was going to take photos to juxtapose with the artist's art, right? And this particular article, I think, was sort of halfway through, or maybe 2/3 of the way through a series of about 13 different articles. And I eventually said I was going to stop contributing. I remember how it happened was the editor wanted me to add a sentence. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, to a particular article. And I said, well, if you want to have it a certain way, do it your way. And then she said, well, if you're not going to change it, I'm going to get rid of the whole article. We're going to cull the entire piece. And when that happened, I kind of realized, you know what, if you're not going to appreciate what I do, then I'm going to stop writing, not only for your magazine, but for magazines as a whole. And although I made that decision out of pique, it was also an important decision to take, because I needed to decide, am I going to continue writing for magazines as a freelancer, or I'm going to start writing for myself as a self-publisher? Am I going to be my own editor, or am I going to have other editors telling me what to do for the rest of my life, kind of thing? And then I made a really tough decision. I decided to write for myself, and I didn't know whether that was going to work, but I made that decision. And then ultimately what happened is this particular company basically folded, and Country Life is no more. I'm not sure if the magazine has been bought by anybody else, but the industry is basically under siege or under threat, right? And so there was certainly a lesson in the landscape that things don't last, and that you've got to organize your own salvation in a way. You've got to find resilience in your own life. And you've got to follow your heart. You've got to find the things that inspire you and move you, and courageously step into the canvas of your world and paint something that is going to mean something to you and be worth something to you, because it's never going to be worth really the same thing to somebody else. So I was just really tired of having my efforts sort of squandered by other people. I wanted to be in charge. I wanted to be the master of my work. And I guess from this point onwards, I really went into true crime in kind of a big way. And I'm now at 99 books. I had to work very hard and very industriously, but I managed to find the independence I was looking for and a measure of resilience. And I want to challenge you guys to do the same. Find your resilience. Find your voice in your world. And so that's it. That was the end of the Namibia trip. And sometimes a stark landscape like that does reach into your soul and it talks to you. And it's important to respond, I think. So if you're finding this coverage interesting, I will be putting up another episode of the final sort of afternoon in Namibia. That's one of my favorite photos, by the way. Photographed at Etosha. The exit out of Namibia. And if you're interested in that, please subscribe to the channel. Also like, share, leave a comment. And I'll see you guys next time.